Thank you again, everybody, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. A very good, diverse group here of panelists with different experiences. Just so everybody's aware, so Fedi, you are founder and CEO of Quorum Cyber, based in Edinburgh, cybersecurity firm. Ming, you are Chief Data and Analytics Officer for NHS England, and John, you are Chief Information Security Officer for the Howden Group. Ming, I think I wanted to start this with you. So the topic of this conference, of course, is modernizing IT without disrupting. Clearly NHS had a majorly disruptive incident this summer when a blood test pathology contractor was hacked, was ransomwared, and disrupted the returning of blood test results for many, many months for many people across the NHS. Can you talk a little bit about the scope of your job as Chief Data and Analytics Officer? How much data are you responsible for? And how was that incident for you?
So my role, NHS England is kind of the regulator for the NHS, so my role spans a couple of ways. I have kind of 1,700 people working for me under data and analytics. I'm the kind of head of profession for data and analytics across the NHS, so a policy kind of role across the NHS. But we run all the live services for a lot of the administrative corporate data, a lot of the data that's used in collections from trusts. So not every bit of data, but a significant amount of data. And then obviously my team also run the kind of statistical reporting and the analytics and the insights from that data.
Yeah. And how was that incident for you when the contractor got hacked? I know it didn't affect all parts of NHS, but a significant...
In a way, because I'm not responsible for cyber, it didn't impact me as much as my colleague, who's the CIO, who has that accountability. But it was a awakening call for us, because we've heard today, as much as you can update your infrastructure, and it takes one thing, one person, for that breach to then impact a lot. And in the lab systems, there was a lot of legacy systems there, and it was, I don't want to go into the ins and outs of it, but it was actually a big impact. And the biggest impact was actually not knowing where our test results were, not being able to support. It was a particular network, it was a large network of labs, which then impacts a number of hospitals, which then impacts a number of GPs, and therefore those patients weren't clear. We had to do a lot of retesting. So the operational pain of that was quite significant.
And to me, that incident, it kind of highlights what we would broadly call supply chain security. This is a contractor which is not under NHS, but obviously does work for NHS, whose IT infrastructure you don't control, right? I mean, you can maybe assess it, you can look at it, but you don't ultimately control it. As you were having conversations with colleagues about, well, how do we prevent this from ever happening again, once kind of the smoke clears and you can see daylight again, what are some of the lessons learned from that incident about, well, how do you manage? I mean, this is kind of the definition of a complex network. It's not even a network you control. What are some lessons learned from that about how you prevent something?
So we have kind of standards. I think it's just working through those standards across the entirety of the supply chain more effectively, being a bit more proactive in terms of the way that we test and check and create audits around compliance to those, and really doing our own tests in terms of what's the prevention that we would do in terms of sending out, speculative details ourselves to check the security of the network. I mean, stuff that everybody's doing. It's nothing new, but the vulnerability of our networks is only as good as people can, in personal compliance, really. And I think that's hard. So a lot of it is about education. A lot of it is making sure that people, when they get caught, they do certain training. So not just the mandatory training that we do, but that applies to all our suppliers as well.
And we talked about this earlier, but NHS is one of the largest workforces on the planet, right? It's 1.5 million people. That's not counting the contractors and those. And what we discussed was that every person, you'll hear from some of the best protected companies on the planet, you're just one admin away from a ransomware incident, like one admin being compromised away. So if you've got 1.5 million employees you have to train them, right? I mean, that's one of the big takeaways as well, is that each of those people has to feel some sense of agency about what I do actually matters, because I could let in these guys, right? If I click on the wrong thing, this same thing could happen. Like, How have you thought about that, or has the incident, changed the way that you think about how do you educate a workforce that large and that diverse?
Yeah, I think it's making sure everyone's aware of the impact of that, not just from an administrative perspective. You just heard Ranil. I mean, part of what we're doing is simplifying the infrastructure so that we can actually get on top of it. But the training and the bringing to fore actually what this means is really important. The NHS is really lucky in a way, in terms of most people that work for the NHS have very strong value base. So if you can connect the security with the value of the impact on patients, you get a lot further. Yeah. That real value of turning up every day to do the best thing. We do have a lot of contractors, kind of bank staff who are temporary, who move from one hospital to another. So the actual around single sign-on, how do we do that to make it more consistent? It's been one of the major cybersecurity programs across the...
Without hijacking, let me just challenge you for something. I think it's unfair to place the burden of that moment on every one individual. So if your entire security strategy is dependent on somebody not clicking on a link, you've done something fundamentally wrong. So in defense of the NHS, I think the complexity of the attacks that they've suffered are not due to one person not following training. If that was what we were relying on, this would have been a disaster much more often than these events. So I think it is more complex than just purely placing the blame or displacing the blame into the individuals. We have a job to do. And if that's what ends up breaking the dam, a lot of things fail upstream from that moment.
Well, and this is something that you have talked about as well, that we've talked about, is that you've come up through essentially the banking industry, right? Like early on.
Actually, built Lloyd's first security operating center.
Is that right?
Sorry, it was 19.
Fedi was involved with a company called Adama Security up in Edinburgh, which built some of the earliest security operations centers for big banks, including Lloyd's, and this was 20 years ago. Yeah. And so you've seen these networks kind of modernize and grow over the course of that career. And we've talked a lot about this fact that there's this myth of securing a network completely. Do you want to talk about that? And it kind of touches on this idea of what's happened with NHS, is that there is this myth that if I buy enough technology, if I hire enough people, my network will be 100% secure. And you think that is just not possible.
I think it's a good objective or something good to keep in mind, but you keep that in tension with the reality that, again, I'm challenging the previous fallacy, which is I don't think you're one admin away from a disaster, right? There's a collection of things that need to happen. And I think the world's learned that no matter how much we invest in this, we were having this chat before, things are going to continue to happen, right? So, and I think that's where I'm having a crisis of identity about our industry a little bit. And how much are we willing to ask people to invest and still not make this problem go away? Because this is an escalating problem. If this was cancer treatment, we would have taken a different approach a long time ago, because it's just not. So I think we've accepted that things are going to happen no matter how much effort we throw at this. And we move towards the resilience part of the conversation of, okay, now we need to accept that we need to stay in the fight even if we're getting punched. And that has been a change of tact compared to the previous idea of I can invest enough to get away from this problem. Right. And that's a refreshing take on how do we stay in the fight even if we are getting hit constantly from different things.
And you've talked about, when you meet with clients, obviously with Quorum Cyber now, that one of the things you tell them is, my goal is not necessarily to make you 100% secure. My goal is to make sure that if you get hit, you can continue. Like your business will continue, we will resolve the issue for you. What are the 2 or 3 ways that companies can think about doing that? Because cyber seems like such a big, amorphous problem. How do we get a handle on it, especially if you have a large number of employees and a large number of users? What are the 2 or 3 ways when you go into a company, a new client engagement, that you try to address those issues to say, I might not be able to do everything, but I will keep you operational?
Look, 2 quick points. I think one is a philosophical one. I think we need to move them away from this idea that you can resolve this through technological solutions only, and that this is a technology problem. It isn't. It's a fundamental business continuity problem. And I think ultimately in the longness of time, business continuity becomes the overarching umbrella of all of this. And then the second one is train and test and make sure that this isn't an abstract concept that lives in a project plan somewhere on the left that every now and then you distill off to tick the box of we've reviewed the plan. This has to be muscle memory. And if it's muscle memory, it's like the goalkeeper that catches the penalties. You want the guy that's been in the goal and that's caught 10 attempts on target. The one that's in the bench hasn't been tested. isn't going to be the most effective one at dealing with the reality of a bad day. So I think good training, good continuous evaluation of the scenarios, and actually being in the line of fire a lot, I think is super helpful.
And you've told me as well about clients or prospective clients for your firm that will call you and you will go out on an engagement and you will tell them, can you tell the audience a little bit about these interactions where you'll get a sense very quickly that the person calling you might be very interested in cybersecurity and securing the organization, but you get a sense that their management might not be either aware or on board, which is kind of, and so what happens then when you walk into a client engagement and you get the sense that their management might not be fully on board with this?
Look, a lot of our time, our industry has evolved through the technical field, right? So the people that are in positions of power are intrinsically technical. They haven't grown through the business. And I think hopefully that's changing, but our field was dominated by geeks that became managers and leaders. And one of the things we've learned is unless we start connecting the rest of the business, risk, operations, audit, legal, we're fighting a battle alone that we can't win. This shouldn't be placed on one individual, the CISO of our organization. This is a business team. But in this problem, we're still looking at one human to solve the whole thing. No other problem in an organization that is this important, fundamental to their existence, is delegated to one human. There's an executive team that deals with this. Cybersecurity isn't the case. So for a lot of the time when you're coming across that one person who's still holding the entire dam, the best job that you can do is take a step back and connect them to the rest of the business, or bring the rest of the business to understand the problem.
And so you will say to the head of cybersecurity, this meeting is fine, I need to speak to your boss. Before we will go ahead with the contract, your boss, the CEO.
Just to be clear, I'm not leaping over anybody to go talk to anybody's boss, but I think we need to bring more people to the conversation. I think we shouldn't be fighting this alone. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think from a data and analytics perspective, there's so many things in the way that you manage your data pipelines, the way that you go from whether it's role-based access control. We're in the NHS with very personal data, going to purpose-based access control, which containerizes your risk. And that's kind of the view of how we would do it as well. It's not just the systems that you come in. You know, bringing all data together in a data lake is fascinating for cybersecurity people, but we can actually containerize that as well. So I think you're absolutely right, it's a team sport, and unless it's seen as a team sport, then you're more likely to fail.
And the cybersecurity people I've talked with, I mean, including yourselves, the ones that have management support get a lot more done, right? I mean, when they're behind on that mission. And John, now you raised a very interesting example when we spoke earlier about this idea of IT complexity, right? Howden Group is obviously a global, right, insurance company. You guys have operations, around the world. And do you want to tell the audience how many companies your company has bought in the past year and what that has meant for you as the CISO of this organization?
Yeah. Over the last year, about just over 60 companies.
You guys bought over 66 companies in 12 months. Right.
So that does create a huge problem. And by the way, I'm not sure I totally agree with some of your points, unfortunately. But I do see a lot of companies who have underinvested in IT. They've got a long way to go, and acquire a company, and they haven't got the basics. It's to your point, really. They're sitting there with a remote access with no VPN, and they're not doing vulnerability management. They're not getting the basics right. They've got no monitoring systems. So somebody gets in, nobody's watching. They might have an endpoint protection, but they've got nobody actually watching the console. So they're not got the basics. So what we've done is we have a fairly robust structure of how we handle acquisitions. Obviously, pre-deal, we do a big due diligence exercise. We understand what their current situation is, do a full detailed risk assessment. Post-deal, my team go and do a cybersecurity assessment. We built a framework around CIS and ISO and a number of different frameworks, but we built a framework. The team goes in a full assessment. We run a series of tools to analyze their environment, and we understand where their gaps are, and we figure out in a very pragmatic way, from a prioritized way, what we're going to fix to bring this maturity of this business up to a level set standard that we're trying to get the whole of the company. I've done that for 64 assessments so far, and we're working a way to keep that maturity standard up. Right. The next thing we do is we look to integrate those businesses into a group organisation. So we've built and invested in a security framework and architecture, and we're moving people into that environment. We use Azure. We built in a load of very good tools into that environment to protect, to monitor our environment, and we're bringing people into that group, and then we can monitor them and manage it for them and support them.
Yeah, I remember learning years ago that one of the most dangerous times from a cybersecurity perspective for a company is the moment between when they announce they've been acquired and when the acquisition actually happens.
Yep.
Because if you're a big company buying a little company, the hackers look at the little company and say, I'm going to hack you to get into the bigger company.
Yep.
And so with Howden buying 66 companies over the past 12 months, and you also mentioned something interesting about what you have to do to reduce the complexity of their IT infrastructure. You kind of touched on it, which is you move to the Azure cloud. That often involves getting rid of their IT equipment, right? Like their IT infrastructure has to go. Like the physical infrastructure has to go.
Yeah, that integration is we are essentially moving their platforms and applications into Azure, shutting down their infrastructure. And then from then on, my team are monitoring and managing that environment for them. Obviously we've built a big security architecture, and they're benefiting from that. Yeah. After we've moved them to Azure, then we don't really need their local servers or their local data center. There are some things that we need to manage in a data center, and we maintain, as somebody else was saying, there are things that we believe just need to be are not ready for the.
I mean, it sounds like a huge, complex operational challenge to onboard that many companies from that many parts of the world with that many different people and architecture and infrastructure.
Yep.
And it sounds like what you're saying too. The cloud, as Ranil just mentioned, gives you a single point of kind of visibility into your security risks and things like that. Is that right? Is that why kind of the cloud is appealing?
I've got instances in the US and across Europe and Asia Pac and Australia. So I've got Azure instances all over the place. But I have a single framework that's managing all that. I've got, we use, and we put EDR products on all our endpoints, our servers. So we've got them, MDR monitoring all of that. We've got a SOC in place that's monitoring all environments, collecting logs from all of that environment and feeding a single SOC and monitoring all of that. So
single point of view.
We have a CNAPP tool, which I mentioned before. We use Wiz, so we use a CNAPP tool, which is in addition to monitoring your looking for malware, it's also looking for vulnerabilities. It's looking at your network. It's looking at Kubernetes and containerized applications. So it's giving you lots of different information, all of which is getting fed into a single environment, and we're watching that all the time.
That's right. And Ming, I wanted to ask you as well, is we've talked about the security risks of these complex networks, but you raised a great example of why networks modernize in the first place. NHS, of course, was in the news a lot this summer for a couple of reasons, but one of which was the Palantir deal, right? The NHS is now using Palantir, and watching it from the outside, like it kind of makes sense why there's controversy or whatever around it. But you had some really good examples of the use of Palantir inside the NHS has some very tangible effects that we as patients of the NHS can feel and see. Can you talk a little bit about operating theaters and how Palantir helps you book operating theaters in a much more efficient way? I found this to be a very interesting part of our conversation.
Yeah, so it's quite fascinating how theatres are managed in the first place. So it's a supply chain issue. The scheduling is the mix of bringing data from the electronic patient record, the rostering systems for staff, and staff in terms of the clinician, clinical team, the anaesthetist, and some of you may or may not know that the mixture of the anaesthetist and the clinician will make the difference between a procedure being a 15-minute procedure or a 30-minute procedure. So you can halve your productivity if you have the wrong mix. Making sure that the patient has had all their checks and vitals, the COVID test and all those things. They've done the pre-assessment. All of that coming together, we have a business process that the platform has enabled us to inform, so we can plan 6 weeks out, 4 weeks out, 2 weeks out before bringing patients in. The platform is actually quite agnostic to whether it's an AI model or whether it's connections. The workflow is what's helped us. So instead of people planning on bits of Excel, and pieces of paper and lots of emailing backwards and forwards, which is, for me, it's a logistics issue. They can do all of that in the platform now. It's not rocket science, but it's actually practically, it means that for a patient, you can turn up and you don't have to be sent home, because that's one of the major problems. You have to reorganise your life to have that procedure, and then you get turned away at the door. For staff, for clinical staff, the surgeons, they now own their waiting list, which actually has been a very good psychological difference for them, because they feel like they can prioritise the patients where they know they're having pain or worse effects, because they actually know their list, they know their patients really well. This is the human side that the AI will never take over. They actually know and own their patients, so that's great. And what we've been looking at is, once we know that mix and the preferences, even we're going down to the preference of, if you do a stent in a cardiac event, what type of stent a particular surgeon prefers to work with, because that's what they've trained at and how they're more efficient. Their preference cards are now being digitised so that we can actually make sure the products are available at the right time for the right thing in much more advanced, which longer term, we were just talking about it today, what I want to, being a supply chain person myself, I want to then get a better deal, get a, pull logistics rather than a push. And therefore we'll have savings in products as well. But all of that is quite interesting. The machine learning that we've done, the AI will now predict the timings, and it will offer the clinicians and the scheduling team, this is the right, based on your mixture of availability, here's the next patient that can fit that slot. So we're maximising the use of theatres, and in the results that we've had in the hospitals where we've put the product in, we're saving like 5 to 7% of utilisation, which sounds not a lot, but in the NHS, one extra procedure every day makes a big impact on productivity. So, being able to change productivity between 5 and 7% is actually a big deal.
And I remember at the time, some of the concerns regarding Palantir's involvement with NHS was the concentration of all this data in one place. And that was kind of, what was being debated. Hearing you talk about it, is that a security risk? Well, potentially. But the reason you do it is, as you're describing, you're bringing, in this just one example, you're bringing the scheduling data from all of these different specialists all together in one place to say they're all free at this time. It's a very practical, concrete way to understand. If you bring that data together, it might be a security risk, but also the reason you do any of this stuff is to make sure you can deliver
We've been
care.
really careful and considerate. We don't take the entirety of the clinical record, which may have a lot of sensitive information. We only bring the data into the platform that you need for that purpose. So it's a purpose-based access. It's also a purpose-based usage. So each of the data elements are considered. What's the data you need? What's the insight you need to make that decision and take an action? So it's very action-orientated, which is why the clinicians like it, because it helps them do their job better. Over time, we'll build, with the live flows, more of a digital twin of the NHS, which then allow us to do more sophisticated scenario planning, which again will be much more effective. We're also looking at AI in terms of discharge, creating an automated discharge letter, and some of the testings that we've done with patients, they actually prefer it to the clinician written one. If you've ever had a letter when you go home from a procedure, it doesn't really explain to you what it is. We can make it a bit more empathetic. We can make the language simpler through AI. We're now just testing that, and we're going through, human in the loop just to check that that's valid. It's exciting times, but having a platform, regardless of who supplied that platform, has meant that we can actually create our data foundations much easier. The way that we purchase the licenses is multiple instances, but along a common framework. So again, that segregates the data, but allows you to connect it when you want to connect it. We have very good audit trails of who's actually accessed the data, for what purpose, and what data they've looked at. So that transparency for the public has been quite helpful.
A very good security trail. Yeah, and Fedi, I wanted to kick this one to you. I mean, one of the incidents I wanted to talk about was the CrowdStrike outage, earlier this summer, which was one of the best examples to me of both, a technology that's really good at what it does in securing networks, but also an example of how when you get IT networks that are this complex, a tiny error can cause mass outages around the world. And now, Fedi, you and I spoke, you know, the day that this happened, and something that you said stuck with me is that, you know, your quote was something along the lines of, this was an example that as an industry, the security industry is moving too fast. Can you talk about what that means in the context of complex networks?
And it wasn't, just for the record, it wasn't something we said was a security incident, right? Yes, it was an outage, but it wasn't a security incident, which is important. It's different to some of the other examples. I think it does show how interconnected this whole thing is, right? We built a deck of cards on some pieces that are fundamental to the operational society. CrowdStrike is a huge part of the market, the same as Microsoft, some of the other names that we battered around today. And I don't think we put a lot of care into the resilience of that architecture, because it is moving fast. Too fast? I don't know what too fast means. I just think society hasn't had a conversation about the risks that we're willing to trade off for that innovation and that potential benefit. And that's part of the conversation we're having here. I think the NHS is probably behind what society wanted it to deliver, but I think some of the adoption we've done in other aspects of society have moved faster than in nobody can fly for 48 hours because CrowdStrike does an update that is not well managed.
And as you point out, CrowdStrike was not hacked. This was an update of theirs that they had developed, and it had a glitch. It had an error, and that error caused this cascading outage.
And it wasn't even CrowdStrike, right? It was CrowdStrike's interaction with Microsoft, and it was the contact between those two that failed. So this is complex, and we haven't really made it any simpler, and we're not making it any simpler. And now we're conceding control to black boxes and AI. So good luck.
And now, John, you had personal experience with this. Do you want to talk about the CrowdStrike incident and kind of what that day was like for you at Howden?
It wasn't a very good day. I was, as a matter of fact, I was putting my towels on my loungers on holiday when I took the call, and my team lead told me that this had happened. Anyway, it took down 930 servers. It took out about 500 laptops, so I had a major issue. And it's kind of lucky it was on a Thursday morning, early morning, and a lot of people probably go home on a Thursday night, take their laptops, should turn it off, and don't turn it on until Friday morning, if they do turn it on. And so the user impact was a little bit minimal, but the server impact was quite massive. But my team managed to recover it all by before Monday morning. We brought back up 930 servers over the weekend. So kind of spoiled my weekend and holiday, but we managed to get it back up. And the business was like, well, look, it didn't touch us.
Right.
No kidding, it did touch us, and so they just didn't know that it touched us.
That's how you do your job well. Wait, so what does an organization like yours, what do you learn from an incident like that? Because you're not just going to take your CrowdStrike software and throw it out. Because as Fedi says, this is just a function of our increasingly complex, IT system. Yeah. What lesson do you take from that? What do you change? What do you do to reduce the likelihood that something like that could happen again?
Oh, actually, after every major incident like that, we run what we call corrective actions. So we run a continuous improvement activity. We invited CrowdStrike in to explain what happened. Cool. So they came in and talked to us. We went through the root cause. We made some changes, but one of the things that we definitely looked at is where are the other single points of failure in my infrastructure, and where they're making changes that I don't control, and identify what those are, and then make sure that we've got.
And you found more.
Absolutely, there are others. Microsoft's going to be one of them, either. But there are others. I'm a big user of Mimecast, for example. If Mimecast did the same thing, we'd probably take my mail systems out for a period of time, for example. Yeah. Right, so. Looking at what are the contingencies that you're going to build in, and how can you recover faster.
So it is a teaching moment.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Identifying single points of failure, building some controls around those. That's one way to manage, as Fedi is saying, this increasingly complex nature of these IT networks. We do have some questions here. Don't have a lot of time, but we'll get through some of these. This is for Ming. How do you see the proposed league tables for the NHS impacting or disrupting your role?
I wasn't expecting that question.
It's a very specific question for you.
My team report on the league tables, so we report on performance every day, so it doesn't really change it. It's what we do.
Okay. And then next question is, I guess, for everybody. Why opting for an American AI provider for NHS versus going with a national company? I'm not sure I understand that question.
Well, I do. Okay. Why Palantir against
why
a UK company? We went through a public procurement process. Everyone was able to, bid for that work, and they came out the best.
Right. Got it. We are almost out of time here. Everybody, I really appreciate your time here today. I mean, obviously, we could continue this conversation, for a long time, but I appreciate all the perspectives you guys are able to provide. And
Thank you
guys again for being here.
Thank you very much.
Yay.